Raja Swamy is a social anthropologist with an interest in the political economy and political ecology of natural disasters. In this conversation, we unpack the ideas in his recent book, Building Back Better in India, Development, NGOs, and Artisanal Fishers After the 2004 Tsunami. This is a disaster that killed nearly 230,000 people. It's traumatic, but Raja takes us into that trauma in order to talk about what it meant in the wake of that disaster for states and multinational companies to see it as an opportunity to rebuild in a manner that prioritized profit and alignment with global financial regimes, rather than in a way that put the needs of already existing grassroots networks and forms of collective labor first. Swamy's generous generative answers to my questions about his work tell an extraordinary tale of globalization and its effects in post-tsunami India. He explores how gifts in that context were in many cases really sort of lures or bribes designed to displace existing worlds through incentivizing the realization of a different, more exploitative one. What he calls the glib neoliberal rhetoric of reconstruction really disregarded and continues to disregard as we enter into a period of intensifying climate impacts. The energy, self-sufficiency, insight, and agency of the so-called developing world, and those whose lives, livelihoods, and life worlds stand to be most affected by climate change. What would it mean, Raja asks, to look to people in these frontline positions as the best guides to the future we want? We're talking about the use of disaster for the purpose of pushing through opportunistic development, the privatizing of land and the displacement of populations from the world they know. It feels inevitable, this orientation of development toward the dictates of the free market, but it isn't. Raja poses the question of why it's assumed that in the interest of gaining autonomy or economic well-being, people should be forced into a position of really underdevelopment and neglect under neoliberalism. It's in this context that he says we should be thinking about how to change the way we think and talk about things like climate adaptation, this idea of building back better. As he pointedly says, better for whom? As disasters become more frequent and the need to build and rebuild becomes more profound and more pressing, we should be asking what kind of world we want and who we mean when we say we. I wanted to ask first, actually, about the political and personal motivations that you had in writing your important book, Building Back Better in India, Development, NGOs, and Artisanal Fishers After the 2004 Tsunami. Where did the book start, basically?
My initial interest was in the kind of ways in which disasters are becoming more increasingly viewed as opportunities for various kinds of economic policies. So I've been interested in neoliberalization in India as well as other parts of the global south. More broadly, just thinking about the ways in which, welfare systems are being undermined and sort of the reorientation of economic development priorities towards globalization, towards liberalization of the economy, towards privatization of resources, and so on. I was interested initially in seeing how the tsunami and its effects were kind of impacting those processes that were already underway. And my hunch was that it was sort of, given that disasters are being seen as opportunities more and more by various governments around the world, that this was sort of also another example of that. And I kind of started with the assumption that there was going to be a kind of a confirmation of what I expected, which is that there's going to be an effort to privatize land, an effort to displace populations, an effort to kind of open up opportunities for capital that were kind of not impossible but difficult to achieve prior to the disaster. So that's what drew me in there. A kind of related concern for me also was the ways in which these marginalized populations have been undermined over, during that time before 2004, almost for more than a decade, had been like massively undermined by neoliberalization, but which also kind of had its precedent, had its kind of prehistory, if you will, in the ways in which the Indian state had been promoting what it assumed to be priorities of economic development, sort of technological modernization, and so on, which had, in many cases, pretty negative effects on natural resource dependent populations. So I was also interested simultaneously in what the effects of the tsunami were and its aftermath were going to be on these natural resource dependent populations, particularly artisanal fishers in on the coasts of southern India.
Right. And because you kind of opened up this issue of kind of economics and its social impact, neoliberalization, maybe it makes sense to go in that direction first. One of the things that it seems like you're kind of working through is this sort of tension in the wake of disasters between aid and preserving autonomy in, as you say, like the disaster-ridden horizon of late neoliberalism. Um, can you sort of kind of give us an overview in some sense of the history of India's neoliberalization, neoliberalism and the law as like an instrument of that sort of economic restructuring, and what it means to think of disaster as an opportunity or as a moment for opportunism economically?
On the first question, which is the sort of the overall impacts of the disaster itself, this was perhaps one of the most destructive disasters at that time in 2004. Um, Overall, I mean, more than 180,000 people were killed across Asia, as well as in, to a smaller degree even in the east coast of Africa. Um, Nagapattinam district, where the tsunami had its worst impacts in India, which is where I conducted my research, um, so had close to, I mean, the estimates range from 10 to 12,000 people died in India, and about most of them were in this region, in the Tamil Nadu coast, and largely in Nagapattinam district. So in decades prior to the tsunami, this region had been largely considered quote unquote backward, like economically backward, as in it had little industrial activity, little by and pretty poor figures in terms of things like literacy, and very high rates of poverty and so on. So it is kind of ironic that this region was considered backward, but also at the same time, it's the kind of the delta region of the Kaveri River, where which is considered the rice basket of southern India. So it's a very agriculturally productive district. Now the fishing communities of this region, they live in largely autonomous villages, semi-autonomous villages, and these artisanal fisher villages have been, variously referred to as hamlets, as villages, but in certain urban contexts, they have been kind of rechristened slums and so on and so forth, because they're sort of not always recognized by the state as actually legitimate kind of administratively distinct units. They have enjoyed a certain kind of autonomy, but that autonomy has also meant a certain kind of neglect. So there's very little infrastructure development in these areas, street lights, paved roads, etc. You had in the 1970s on the encouragement of commercial fishing by the state. And here there was also the kind of introduction of mechanized trawlers and new types of nets and fishing gear and so on, uh, with the goal of spurring a technological modernization of the fishing economy. Now, this side of the economy, the so quote unquote modern fishing economy, largely centered around wage labor. Now, what ended up happening in the 1970s and 80s after the introduction of trawlers, of mechanized trawlers and commercial fishing, was that a large number of people involved in a large number of people involved in the commercial fishing economy were drawn from the same communities that were doing artisanal fishing. Now, the government's developmentalist narrative presumed that with the introduction of modern technology, you gradually phase out the older, quote unquote, primitive forms of economic activity and replace those with these more modern forms. But what ended up happening was that mechanized fishing operations were competing with the artisanal fishers in the same near shore, fishing grounds. Instead of venturing out farther into the sea in order to fish, given the fact that they have new technology and so on, they were actually competing in the near shore, and this ended up leading into pretty intense conflicts between artisanal fishers and the mechanized fishing economy. So there was a kind of conflict-ridden context to the development of the fisheries. Now, within this context, the Indian state uh, kind of sought to sought to play a mediating role, but more often than not, many of these conflicts were reduced to questions of law and order. So here's where law kind of becomes something that, in effect, while favoring mechanized fishing, also has to concede that the artisanal fishers do have customary claims and rights over the nearshore fishing grounds. Now,
Right. That's interesting. Yeah.
so this was a sort of tenuous situation prior to the tsunami. Now, another factor that also became a huge source of contention for the artisanal fishing communities prior to the tsunami was the introduction of aquaculture, shrimp farms throughout the coast. Now, the Indian state, again, in its sort of, now in a more neoliberal vein, was trying to introduce shrimp farming with initially the ostensible goal of improving food security. But in effect, this actually became a means by which the World Bank was promoting an activity that could help support the balance of payments, which is what the World Bank was more interested in. So, which meant that the shrimp farms were directed primarily towards export markets. And so the whole food security thing also fell by the wayside because now shrimp cultivation was really being encouraged in order to capture export markets or to tap into export markets. This led to huge conflicts because shrimp farms are, these are kind of so-called brackish water shrimp farms.
Hmm.
They are built along the coastline and they utilize seawater, and they are, on multiple counts, really problematic for artisanal fishing because artisanal fishing involves not just sort of access to the sea, but also the use of the coast. Plus, a lot of these communities have their homes, and the villages are along these on these coasts. So shrimp farms impinge upon the water resources of these coastal communities. They pollute them. They because they're exclusive private property kinds of operations. They restrict access to the beaches, and the beaches are widely used by artisanal fishers, not only for this is where they launch their beach craft from. Most of these boats that they use are beach craft, so they're pushed out into the sea, and then the motors are switched on, and then they kind of go out into the sea, and they land their craft on the beach, and they land their fish on the beaches. Fish are dried on the beaches very extensively. The beaches are used for fish drying. They're used for storing and mending nets and storing engines and all of their boats. So
Hmm.
artisanal fisher villages are kind of visually very distinct. You actually see a row of boats kind of parked on the beaches in front of these villages, right? So the shrimp farms now impinge upon these kinds of uses, and so they came into a big conflict here. Now, again, here the law, where does the law come in? Well,
Hmm.
uh, long story short, there was a kind of a nationwide uh, movement against shrimp farms and the expansion of shrimp farms. First, initially led by ecologists, but then later artisanal fishing communities across the coast in Tamil Nadu as well as Kerala and other parts joined the struggle, and they managed to push the Supreme Court of India to kind of put a stop on shrimp farms. The law de jure
Hmm.
put a stop on shrimp farms, but de facto there was sort of the tacit kind of complicity between the state authorities and shrimp farm operators, and the encouragement of shrimp farms didn't really fully stop, and that continued. So that was a kind of context where artisanal fishers are now struggling over, on the one hand, with the previous round of development, this fight with commercial and mechanized fishing for fishing grounds, and kind of these big operations that are destructive as well. And on the other hand, with shrimp farms now over the coast. So here's where questions around not only access to the sea and the regulation of marine resources comes into full view, but also the very right to be on the coast comes into full view.
Right.
Now, added to that, there were other kinds of activities as well, encouraged by the state in the name of development, such as industrial activities. So power plants, chemical plants, and so on. So certain parts of the state, in the name of development, were being targeted for these kinds of activities, which were again impinging upon the activities that artisanal fishers engage in, and there was kind of a context of struggle. Now, here is where the humanitarian, so-called humanitarian angle in the book comes into play, which is one of the major vehicles for artisanal fishers to fight back against these processes, largely a fight back against shrimp farms, but also various industrial and tourist activities, etc., that was promoted by the state, was the work of one particular organization called SNEHA, Social Needs Education and Humane Awareness. It's a kind of acronym, SNEHA. Was active in Nagapattinam district and Karaikal, which is sort of very, it's adjacent to and almost enveloped by Nagapattinam district. It's a very strange administrative arrangement. Karaikal belonged to what is called Pondicherry, and Pondicherry was a French colony. So there's a kind of interesting backstory to the ways in which these administrative units came up. But the coast is continuous, and the fisher communities have relationships with each other regardless of these sort of administrative boundaries. They share kin ties and cultural, historical ties. So Karaikal and Nagapattinam districts fisher communities were being mobilized by SNEHA from the late 1980s. And so by the time the tsunami comes into effect, these communities have succeeded in pushing back against the expansion of shrimp farms, at least de jure. And they have also become politically mobilized, and so they've become, capable of organizing themselves in ways that were not evident before. So now you had SNEHA organized political mobilizations against chemical pollution by industries, against the creation of fences by shrimp farm operators, and also for making demands of the local administration for things like street lights, for things like putting an end to discrimination against women fish vendors who carry fish to the various urban markets, access to buses, or giving making demands such as providing women fish vendors, also providing them compensation of the same kind that men fish vendors receive on particular months of the year when there's the sort of they're not allowed to fish because of the depletion of fish. There was sort of arrangement whereby certain months of the year you put a stop to fishing.
You draw a really kind of stark distinction between SNEHA and other NGOs, right? In India, like you say, like in the book, you give this account of NGOs that I don't think many people necessarily would read and think, yeah, of course, this aligns perfectly with my conception of NGOs. What you say is that NGOs have a huge impact on recovery efforts, and that by some accounts, India has one NGO for every 600 people, which is incredible. These are organizations that you write wield considerable financial power and that play a significant role in shaping and determining economic priorities and strategies. Like, I'm not sure that many people think of NGOs in those terms. Yeah. And as you say, like, they're usually kind of depoliticized. Was part of the point in juxtaposing, for example, SNEHA with these other, this panoply of NGOs, to sort of clarify the structure of power in terms of their influence and their impact in India, and to kind of examine like what benefits NGOs accrue by being depoliticized?
Yeah, well, so one of the things that because I was focused primarily on trying to make sense of what is going on in the aftermath of the tsunami.
Sure.
One of the things that I kind of was looking at was how NGOs have become kind of, incorporated into the state's efforts to displace these populations, and what they ended up, what ended up as a public-private partnership. Is for the official language for it was that these were, public-private partnerships between individual NGOs and the state government. Um, was that the state government would kind of, the NGO would show that it had adequate resources for construction of houses, and had the kind of, had the logistical kind of resources in place, and the state would approve of construction, but the state government would identify and procure the sites where these NGOs would be allowed to build. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So at the outset, what it did was that the non-governmental organization, as an entity invested in doing social service, was divested of any potential political kind of entanglement. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So we only build. We have no say in where we build. Now, where we build is a critical issue for artisanal fishers,
Of
because
course.
for them, this was immediately, the question arises. Well, we do not want to leave the coast. A large number, vast majority of people were like, we're not going to leave the coast. I mean, these are our homes, these are our villages, and some of these villages, I was digging through the history of some of this, some of these villages, and some of these villages find mention in texts going back to the 7th century. I mean, this is like, they
Right.
have deep histories, right? They're older than the Indian state, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so here they are fighting to kind of retain access to the coast, and in come these NGOs signing MOUs, memoranda of understanding with the government, where they are basically, agreeing to build houses, and build these houses on sites procured and identified and procured by the government, without consulting with the fishing communities or considering their concerns over location. Now, to be fair, some NGOs brought this up in the meeting minutes of the collector's office, the local administration. It's clear that some NGOs did bring this up. But did they fight hard to kind of represent fisher interests in these processes? Not
Right.
quite. So,
Mm-hmm.
and for that again, it's, on the, when folks critique NGOs, we often tend to say like, oh yeah, they're apolitical, they promote a kind of anti-politics and so on and so forth. But to understand how they were even allowed to operate there is where I think the real question lies, which is that the state, the neoliberal era, we like to think of the state as having withered away and kind of become really useless and become beholden to capital and so on and so
Sure.
forth. But what's interesting in this context is that the Indian state, and at its state level, the state functional, structures were very kind of assertive in insisting on how this reconstruction of Nagapattinam should take place, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
they were able to kind of mobilize the NGOs in this very particular way by depoliticizing their impacts as much as possible, and thereby, quote unquote, I mean, quote unquote, depoliticizing the impacts, and thereby actually politicizing them, which is that
Mm-hmm.
they brought them into the kind of into the agenda of relocation, and utilizing this as a way of saying, look how wonderful it is. We have so many NGOs who are doing such amazing work. They're building
Exactly.
thousands of houses, and these houses are free, and they are, they're solid brick and mortar constructions, and the each house, and here's where it gets really fascinating, because the state government was also extolling its own kind of commitment to gender equity by ensuring that each house was given, the owner of the house would not just be the male head of household, but the male and female head of household, right? So the
Right.
official legal title to the house would be put in the name of the male and female heads of household. Um, there were various other such kinds of things that the state government could now draw upon and say, look, this is social service at its best. Look at all of these wonderful organizations that have come here. We're organizing mobile, and a lot of NGOs in their own self representation, you know, really kind of celebrated their work in Nagapattinam, and they said, hey, we've done great work. World Vision, for example, records that it built thousands of houses, and it kind of provided various kinds of resources for the communities, and so on and so forth. The question for me was that, where does this leave the political economic interests of the artisanal fishing communities, right? And those interests are bound to location and to the coast. And that's where,
Exactly.
yes, and that is exactly where Sneha played a huge role, where I mean, very different role. And their role was basically to ensure that no matter what the kinds of interventions, that they engage in, and Sneha did build houses, but they built houses in a manner that was sort of outside the scope of the state's kind of public-private partnership model. They worked with local communities at the very kind of in a very kind of fine-grained micro level, and they identified folks who needed homes, and they helped negotiate arrangements within these village communities to identify sites for the building of new homes, or in many cases they helped rebuild and reconstruct old homes with resources. They had a kind of a staggered system of construction, where they would advance one particular installment of the loan of a grant, and then they would come and inspect and see what's been done. They would offer engineers and contractors as and to the households. And over time, some of these, I mean, these homes were built in a more staggered way, but they ended up helping a lot of these folks maintain their access to the coast and stay in their villages, as opposed to many of the others who took houses, but they had to kind of abandon their homes and relocate inland to various sites. So Sneha managed to do this because it was cognizant of the fact that there was a kind of political agenda to the government's reconstruction policy, and that cannot be overlooked in the euphoria over how wonderful it is that NGOs are building houses and so on and so forth.
Sure, yeah. And that, I mean, like, that agenda is the key, is like being able to perceive it and name it. Like, one thing you note is that policymakers view certain livelihood strategies as subsistence activities, not as proper economic activities contributing to GDP,
Yeah.
right? So this is, where you talk about the kind of marginal nature, or literally like operating at the edges of the state's terrestrial sovereignty of, fisher society, being in some sense almost a threat to neoliberal globalization because it can't be absorbed easily. And like,
Yeah.
your research shows that there are lots of NGOs who share a specific kind of quasi-humanitarian perspective that can itself be absorbed in neoliberal strategies, where basically subsistence activities need to more or less be disciplined and brought into the logic of economic growth. And it feels to me like you kind of discovered the main way that disciplining can happen after a disaster like this is through what you call the so-called gift of housing. You say that, in a sense, the gift became a bribe. What did you mean by that? And can you talk about the implications of so-called Government Order 172?
Huh. So the gift and the bribe. So,
Right.
this is a fascinating example of to look at the gift through this old anthropological debate around the gift. Marcel Mauss in the early 20th century came up with this explanation for what a gift is. And a gift, there's always an implicit sort of expectation of a return when one offers a gift. And a gift is intimately tied to social relations, often unequal social relations, right? A gift is not something that I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's a way of sort of thinking about power and social relations with these sort of material exchanges. But to what the housing gift, right? For me, when I looked at this stuff, and I was fascinated by the various conversations I had with individual folks who were who were trying to decide, should I take the house or not? Should we take the house or not? And here were some of the kinds of questions, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
if I take the house, if we as a household were to take this house, we would be moved, 2 kilometers inland, or in one case, 6 kilometers inland. It would require a strenuous effort every day to make our way to the coast, or 3 times a week at least, to make our way to the coast to go fishing. It would require a strenuous effort for us to maintain connections with our village community, right? What will happen to our children? Where will they study? Where will we go for a hospital? Right? We're accustomed to a certain kind of continuity within our fishing villages. Now that will be broken. So
Mm-hmm.
what will happen to us overall, right? Now, on the other side, well, the house that they're offering us is a brick and mortar house, and it's solid. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's it's nice. It's an asset. It's something that we can kind of we can see its material values as well. We can recognize its material values. So the gift now becomes a sort of alluring thing. And in addition, the state government said, now look, contrary to the so many of these artisanal fishing communities live in these hamlets and live on houses that and on lands that are considered officially government-owned wastelands, or there's a term in Tamil called Porambok, which means government-owned wasteland, or the lands that are kind of not capable of providing revenue, right? They're non-revenue lands.
Sure.
Those are not lands like agricultural lands where the government can kind of raise taxes and so on. But again, as I mentioned earlier, these fisher villages go back. I mean, they've existed before the Indian state, modern Indian state. So um, when the government says, "Look, you'll have a house now, which will have a legal title, and you will have all of the kinds of status symbols of ownership, etc., but you must now agree to relocating, abandon all claims on the coast." And in addition to that, as part of this sort of new kind of model homeowning citizen that you will become, you will have to, and as part of that, you will have to pay house taxes. You'll have to take care of your own utility bills. There's a sort of individuated sense in which you become a citizen, right?
Mm-hmm.
You take personal, individual responsibility. Now, each household now becomes an isolated kind of almost like a kind of a an economic entity in and of itself that is now politically seen by the state as a legitimate kind of entity that it can now recognize and engage with. Now,
Mm-hmm.
so on the one hand, there is the problem of leaving the coast. On the other hand, there is the attraction of receiving this house as a gift. Now, for a lot of folks, the question came down to, hey, look, we don't want to say no to the house because the house is clearly valuable, right? It's got material values.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the government stipulation was that if you receive a house, you are not to sell the house, put it up for as collateral for anything. You're not to use the house as you would any material asset. Now, this was yet another sign for fishers that the idea was to get them to loosen their grip on the coast. Basically saying that, look, we want you to actually get out of the coast, and you must live in these houses. You can't rent it to anybody else. You can't put it up for collateral. You can't sell it, etc., etc. Right? This was the government's sort of intention. Now, for fishers, of course, this meant that well, if we can't do that, that means we're going to lose our ability to consider this house, this gift, in the manner that anybody would consider a gift, right? As in, a gift is a material object. Now, to some extent, there's a code of honor that governs how, if somebody gives you a gift, you're not going to, just take the gift and then go out and simply sell it, or,
Mm-hmm.
try to
Right.
attain its material values, because the gift has been extricated out of its material kind of, value system in order to make it, a different kind of object. To put it back into that is considered kind of a dishonorable thing to do. But in this case, they could see that the gift giving here was, done with a kind of with other purposes in mind, and
Mm-hmm.
so there was a kind of almost, bad faith written into the gift economy itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so for Fishers, the question then became, well, if we take the house and we rent it out, or we sell it, or we put it up as collateral, what can happen, right? And so I was actually quite astonished to learn that in many instances, folks had been doing this stuff. There was a sort of gray economy that was at play already, um, where people had been doing this stuff. 2-3 years after the tsunami, they'd already been doing this. They've been using things like NGO pamphlets that these glossy pamphlets that noted, this house has been given as a gift to this, to head of household, and the two heads of household, this person and his wife, and the house now belongs to them, and blah blah blah. And the NGO, it's a sort of a note that it's a self-congratulatory note from the
Sure.
NGO. It's
Yeah.
just a pamphlet, but these little glossy documents were used as legal titles,
As like a deed. Yeah.
as a deed, and they're saying, well, my house is available for you to rent or to buy. Here's the title. And again,
Interesting.
the ironic thing here for me was that, one of the kinds of, one of the how to put it, tragedies of poverty in the world is the way in which market structures, state structures remain illegible to marginalized populations. One must also see how, in these kinds of contexts, people continue to pursue certain kinds of goals and strategies in life by mobilizing these processes nevertheless, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the title that is not a title becomes a title to be used, right, in an exchange process. And when I mentioned to the person who actually revealed this to me and said that, people have been doing this a lot in this neighborhood, uh, his response was not shock. His response was laughter. He was like, well, that's the way it is. I mean, we're just
Mm-hmm.
gonna make do with what we have. So there was a kind of quote unquote bad faith response to the bad faith of the state and the NGOs, which is that, hey, they're trying to cheat us of our lands, so we're going to do what we can.
Yeah.
And some other examples I also describe in the book, where an NGO offers a plate making machine to this village and expects them to start,
Right. This is sort of how you open the book. Yeah.
yeah. So and they decide to sell it, and the NGO is outraged. I mean, how could you sell a gift, right? And they're
Mm.
like, well, we're going to do what we need to do. I mean, because our material interests are important to consider. So
Right.
I think in that sense, that's where I was kind of going with this idea of the gift as a bribe, which is that, you know, uh, uh, under the sheen of humanitarian aid, there was a sort of the hard truth of the fact that there was a process of alienation and subordination that was at work. And Fishers, in their responses, contrary to the kind of the some normative assumptions that we make about, oh, people, they need to be disciplined into these market and state logics and become more honest and truthful, etc. What they were doing was actually on being honest to their own collective interests, and they
Of
were
course.
responding politically to something that they were expected to not.
And really, I mean, working to preserve a way of life. I mean, you talk about how the kind of work that people within the sort of artisanal economy do requires connection. It requires teamwork. You call it
Absolutely.
an intensely time bound chain of activities that just implies a deep solidarity for it to happen smoothly.
Yeah.
And so, relocation becomes more or less like overt effort to break that down.
Yeah.
And so these efforts to, as you say, openly defy prohibitions on reclaiming coastal lands, or treating NGO housing as assets, it's like an act of resistance to that form of kind of disciplining. And it kind of, it does bring us to the sort of, title problem of the book,
Uh-huh.
which is this emerging ideology of building back better
Yeah.
that the UN has kind of codified as a depoliticized sort of response to disasters. And so I want to unpack that with you. And certainly, like, one of the really powerful things about the book for me was the way that you link the response to the tsunami with other related disasters. Like, you're talking here about Hurricane Katrina and the damage done to New Orleans by that disaster. You say that there was a profit-oriented bonanza for shareholders in Hurricane Katrina's wake,
Yeah,
of the
yeah,
same type that we saw in Houston and Puerto Rico in 2017. I know
yeah.
that the book's theoretical underpinnings are like rooted to this notion of disaster capitalism. Why do you stress that these disasters have a way of, you know, privileging this discourse of building back better and not sort of foregrounding the fact that you're also upending and undoing centuries of constructing a distinct identity and sense of place? Like, how did you kind of manage all of those different ideas and themes, and how did you want to politicize basically this idea of building back better?
That's a good question. So for me, the thing that was striking was the way in which this particular phrase kept coming back.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, I mean, people like Bill Clinton are going around, like, talking about building back better. Um, and this was used again and again, like in the years following. It was used after the Haiti earthquake. It was used after the Pakistan earthquake. It was used in various contexts again and again. And the underlying claim is that, well, if things are broken, we don't just replace them. What we're going to do is actually we're going to do even better. We're going to make it even better, right? We're going to
Mm-hmm.
improve things, right? And again, this is sort of the neoliberal kind of ideology, which is that material changes must, are always improvements, and these are improvements that are unqualified improvements that nobody can argue. And say building back
Right.
better. The first
Yeah.
question is like building back for whom, right? Like
Right.
whose world are you rebuilding, right? And building back better in some ways kind of conceals within it the various kinds of claims already being made prior to the disaster, which is that privatization is good. I mean, you saw this in Puerto Rico, right? Privatization of utilities, or the kind of the evisceration of local economies and local material processes. All of these are already underway, and then the hurricane strikes, and after the hurricane, it's like, wow, in order to improve things, what we've got to do is to accelerate these processes and push them through, right? You saw this in
Mm-hmm.
New Orleans. In New Orleans, I mean, they were trying to get rid of teacher unions. They were trying to get rid of public schools. They were trying to push back against municipal workers. Now the Hurricane Katrina comes along, and after that, immediately, in the name of remaking the place and rebuilding it, they basically push through those very neoliberal policies, and there's very little resistance. And that's the argument behind disaster capitalism as well, which is that as a kind of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine kind of makes that clear, right? Like when
Mm-hmm.
people are kind of seriously traumatized by a disaster and have very very little means by which they can actually kind of fight back. That's when these vultures kind of swoop in, right? And they take advantage. Now, for me, disaster capitalism as a term was useful to enter into the analysis. But when I came out of it, I realized that there's something problematic about disaster capitalism that needs to be kind of addressed, which is we think about disaster capitalism purely through the agentive actions and motivations of power.
Mm-hmm.
Capitalism, big states, the military industrial complex, right? Investors, and so on. And that's important. We definitely need to keep an eye on what the hell these guys are doing, right? Every time something
Mm-hmm.
bad happens, they swoop in and say, we're building back better, we're going to reconstruct, we're going to do this. This is happening in Puerto Rico, apparently. There are huge amounts of like resources being handed over literally to these various kinds of investors and so on.
Right.
But what we fail to account for in that, using that term, is the fact that capitalism, if you, go back to capital is a contradiction between capital and labor. Right? It is not only the activity of capital. Right? It is a
Mm-hmm.
contradiction between capital and labor, because there is no value without labor.
That's right.
Right? And so, in that sense, where is the agentive actions of those at the receiving end of disaster capitalism? For me,
Mm-hmm.
that became a question that I could not avoid, because clearly, in the case of post-tsunami Nagapatnam, the active, what you mentioned as resistance, but we kind of put put some quotes around resistance, because it wasn't actually it wasn't actually like overt resistance. It was tacit resistance, right? The ways in
Mm-hmm.
which you kind of work around the system, or push back, or try to kind of manipulate processes in order to avert various kinds of negative outcomes to oneself, right? uh,
Mm-hmm.
that agentive activity is something that we need to grapple with. And so for me, the question really became one of trying to look at these processes as being contested, being pushed back, being kind of being critically examined and approached by the very people who are being displaced, and not to see them as passive victims or objects being acted upon by states or by investors or by private capital, right?
Right.
And so you see this also in New Orleans. I mean, there was a huge movement to defend public housing that, despite the kind of the juggernaut of reconstruction in New Orleans, that did to some degree also succeed in protecting and defending the rights of the poor, marginalized, predominantly African American communities in the city. Right? Now, how might
Mm-hmm.
we account for resistance in these processes is what I'm kind of interested in as well. So the title for me was kind of, a way of foregrounding the glib neoliberal rhetoric of reconstruction. Right?
Yeah.
We're always improving things. We're always, advancing things. We're always making things better. Uh, but with the book, I tried to make the point that one has to look at this in that kind of dialectical manner, right? Thinking about this as as contradiction driven, right? Not
Yeah.
something that just happens in one way. And in the concluding chapter, I do make the point about how, in the era of climate change, I mean, with what's happening now with this massive flood events in urban centers throughout, parts of India. I mean, in cities like Chennai or parts of Kerala state, when these devastating floods hit in 2005 and 2006, it sorry, 2015, I think it was these floods, right? Massive
Mm-hmm.
floods. And now what's happening is that the very artisanal fishing communities that in these urban contexts have been seen as problematic, barriers to development. They prevent the kind of the expansion of the tourist economy, because they're doing their quote unquote unpleasant fishing activities on the coast, etc. These very people who are looked down upon by the middle class that wants to turn beaches into promenades where they could jog in the morning, or they could kind of go for nice little walks like good bourgeois folks, right? The very,
Mm-hmm.
very fishing communities that are seen as a problem were the ones who were actually pulling middle class people from their rooftops in a city that was
Yeah.
flooded, and their cars and their refrigerators and their television sets were all floating in the water, useless. It
Mm-hmm.
was the fishing boats that were actually the only things that were actually working in those spaces when these floods hit. So
Sure.
today, in the era of climate change, we have to ask ourselves, these very people who are marginalized, who are shunted aside by a political economic order that views them as just barriers or dispensable people, they and their vision of the world, their relationship to the natural world, their relationship to kind of to production of value, because after all, these folks are producing food that is, that can actually, is actually feeding people, that can feed people, that can be part of the urban kind of urban menus, right? These folks are probably the ones who we need to be listening to and paying attention to, for a kind of a future that is now, as we are seeing, in the last few weeks with these heat waves, we are getting clobbered by climate change. And the sort of modernization, technological modernization processes that we seem wedded to for decades and decades are now proving to be quite not only useless but actually pretty dangerous. And maybe it is the artisanal fishers, maybe it is the small, small farmers, the food producers, the folks who are tending to soils and nurturing ecosystems carefully and working within contexts where they don't deplete resources or don't destroy resources. They are the ones who might actually save the day for us. And so that's what I was kind of trying to get at here in terms of the activity, not just resistance as in pushing back against power, but also embodying a certain kind of vision for a future that I think we can learn from in our, and discarding our modernist pretensions about industrialization and development based on these sort of destructive processes, deforestation, mining, and getting, depleting the sea of its fish, and so on and so forth.
That is, putting a very fine point on the potential power of not just building back better in the sense of building back bigger, which is what it really feels like very often is the point, right, of reconstruction in the wake of these disasters. It's not really building back better in the sense of greater resilience. It's building back bigger and for the purpose of profit in a lot of instances. And so, your counterpoint that artisanal rather than, let's say, traditional, or because you're very invested in trying to rethink the terms that we use as well to describe people who are typically positioned as the objects of some kind of benevolence or charity.
Yeah.
I did want to ask if you you kind of gestured to it there, if you had any thoughts on climate impacts in relationship to reconstruction, because we're, of course, racing toward a tipping point.
Yeah.
It feels as though we've already passed it. And that itself can be a risk, that feeling that things are past saving, right? And so I wanted to ask about basically the extent to which you're aware of the discussions that are happening around the wildfires that are occurring where I am in Canada, just these heretofore unseen wildfires in terms of scale, where it feels to me like, for example, it has not been much discussion of the scale of the displacement of indigenous peoples that this is going to have caused. But as you say in the book, the ahistorical, event-centric approach to understanding disasters is a problem. That disasters can be, as you put it, profoundly revelatory, but they do reveal in their effects and in the manner in which power seeks to execute recovery agendas, core contradictions, conflicts, and unresolved struggles over material and social life. So I guess it's a way of kind of asking the question of whether, climate impacts will lead us into an era where we are less sort of innocent about these disproportionate impacts, and where, the inevitability of vulnerability will feel less abstract, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at this point, I think what is inescapable is that the lines that we draw between natural and non-natural disasters are quickly fading, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, so what we're seeing now are the impacts of years of global warming, and what's happening now is, I mean, clearly these are storm systems that are, quote unquote natural, but they're intensified and they're getting worse. I mean, Hurricane Harvey poured enormous quantities of water into Houston, and much of that had to do with the unusual warming of the oceans, clearly as a result of global warming.
Mm-hmm.
But to come back to the issue of whether, in this era of climate change, I mean, whether we can kind of see how these kinds of processes of vulnerability, right? How might we think about these processes of vulnerability? Now, mm-hmm. Previously, we used to think about disasters and say, like, wow, when a disaster, Anthony Oliver Smith, a major figure in the development of disaster studies and anthropology, had this wonderful formulation where he said, disaster is basically a hazard coming into play with a kind of a human social context. Right, and when that hazard overwhelms the adaptive capacities of those human social contexts, you have the kind of the occurrence of a disaster. But now, given that we can't really, on the one hand, we can't really draw boundaries between natural and non-natural disasters. Can we rethink vulnerability itself? And for me, the question about vulnerability also, in a sense, is one that we need to politicize what vulnerability means, right? And what do I mean by that? Vulnerability cannot simply mean the differential kind of allocation of risk and harm, right? Some people are more vulnerable. I mean, that's no doubt true. But we need to ask, what are the processes that produce those? And to me, that mm-hmm. leads us into the question of leads us from the question of vulnerability into the terrain of exploitation. So there are exploitative processes that are part and parcel of the value production economy that we live within. Capital enjoins a certain kind of, exploitative, quote unquote, productive inequality. And it requires us, the normal ways in which we live really the source of these processes that make us vulnerable, right? And this part of it is, I feel, one this reframing of the question, right, moving from vulnerability to a question of exploitation, requires us, and simultaneously, if you think about resilience, which is often used, right, like resilient community, we should move from resilience to resistance as we move from vulnerability to exploitation. When we think about these things, requires us to think politically about the future, where these folks are no longer, whether indigenous communities, artisanal fishers, the urban working class, right, poor people, etc., displaced, the houseless folks, etc., undocumented immigrants. Instead of thinking about these folks as sort of, victims, vulnerable victims, let us start understanding how their exploitation within the world is actually what leads to the kinds of processes that have destructive impacts on them as well as everybody else, right? So
Yes.
thinking how we can link the Canadian wildfires, since you asked, with capital, with the ways in which, various kinds of activities. I mean, the fossil economy is heating up the world. We have extreme kinds of, weather, extreme heat and dryness that is making what might have been regular. I mean, this has happened in other contexts. What might have been, kind of seasonal fires turn into, like, unstoppable kind of massive fires that just do, go out of control. Or what might be, like, storm systems that regularly kind of pummel parts of coastal parts of the world now are turning into this, gigantic systems that are, completely devastating entire regions. So what is going on, right?
The colonial and the capitalist conditions, right, of catastrophe is basically what we're talking about, and need to talk about more, I think, openly. But in the way that you kind of try to model, where, like, the point is to talk about groups like Sneha, and to talk about the pushback, and to talk about the ways in which, like, a vision for another more livable planet isn't, like, on the horizon. It's here.
It's here.
You have to know where to look. And it comes, as you also put it, and maybe this would be a meaningful place to end. It's like it is coming from women in particular. Like, you talk about how Sneha established itself as the most successful organizer of women, how women are doing so much of the work within artisanal fisher communities, and then also doing the reproductive labor to keep everyday life operational. Like, so I don't know if you wanted to speak to just sort of like how some vision of radical democracy in, like, a post-carbon future will really feature, like, the power of women. If you've thought about that in the kind of in the time since you wrote the book, and how your thinking has evolved on that.
Yeah, definitely. So what was really striking with Sneha's work was the kind of the linking between what they called sectoral interventions with what they called social interventions. So they made a very clear link, and this is in the 1980s, right? They already made a very clear link saying, like, look, if we're going to pursue, forms of justice, if we're going to, help the fishing community defend itself against the depredations of the developmental policies of the state, the displacing, destructive policies of the state, we cannot see those as separate endeavors from the empowerment of women within the social spaces of these fisher communities. Right? So empowerment within these spaces now means, not only helping politicize women as actors within their own social worlds, demanding, equal treatment within the communities, demanding an end to various kinds of abuse and violence, etc. And basically, a critique of patriarchy that then becomes the means by which, a vehicle through which they can actually help to defend the entire community. And one of the really fascinating things that happens there, in my conversation with some of the veteran activists of Sneha, one of the things that they did tell me was, like, in the beginning, the men used to kind of, be suspicious of us. They were thinking, like, oh, why are these women talking about all this stuff, and what are they doing here? What is Sneha doing here? And they, of course, as usual, they were kind of this patriarchal pushback, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then once they, the women then mobilized, and not only were they fighting against domestic violence and pushing back against the kind of, the horrendous forms of oppression and inequality within these communities. Once they moved beyond that and said, okay, look, we're fighting for equal rights within this thing, so within our communities, so we can actually better defend our rights vis-a-vis the state, right? Vis-a-vis private capital, vis-a-vis all of these kinds of other devastating, destructive things happening out there. So once these women were now going into these political spaces, right? What was interesting was that the state officials also started looking at them saying, like, what are you doing here? Why are you here? Right? I mean, because the state is accustomed to having a kind of conversation among boys, right?
Of course, yeah.
All of a sudden, a group of women are standing there saying, like, we demand streetlights, we demand, compensation, we demand, your various kinds of resources, etc., etc. State officials now begin to see that, wow, their interlocutors within these communities are mobilized, politicized women.
Mm-hmm.
Now that I think tells us something, right? Where we cannot separate the social from the ecological and from the political economic. As in, we cannot fight climate change. We cannot fight for a better world, a livable world. We cannot fight to defend the rights of marginalized people. We cannot fight for a kind of a livable, possibly eco-socialist future if we separate out these kinds of processes one from another. If we take like economic interventions here and then deal with social interventions there. Social empowerment, social power is about the whole thing, about the whole world.
That's right.
So, and I think this is where I kind of, I went in the field very naive, thinking about like, there's a lot of patriarchal oppression in these communities, but how might the fishing community fight back? And I came out of it thinking, wow, if it wasn't for the kind of processes by which women took leadership within these communities and pushed back. And mind you, I mean, I'm not going to, paint a very rosy picture here. Patriarchy is still very, very operative in these communities, and there's a lot of, still patriarchal violence and oppression that women endure and face. But the politicization of these women through Sneha's activities in these village contexts actually linked their empowerment within these contexts with the politicization of the fishing communities themselves. And so they became much more effective at fighting back the state and fighting back against. So there was this fascinating example, one of the veterans of this movement, of the movement against shrimp farms, had shared with me, where the women had threatened to block a train that was sort of in Nagapattinam town. Right? They threatened to block the train, and so they sat on the tracks, and the men sat with them too. And as the train approached, the men got cold feet, and it's very interesting, right? They got cold feet, and they started, one by one, standing up and walking away from the tracks. But the women were steadfast, and they remained on the tracks. And then the men were standing on the sides and basically screaming at the women, saying, "What the hell is wrong with you? You're going to get killed. The train is coming." And then the train screeched to a halt a few feet away from the first woman who was sitting on the tracks. It screeched to a halt, and the women stood up with a with a loud set of slogans, and raised their fists and everything, and the men were just dumbfounded. Right. In a sense, what Indrani, the woman who shared this story with me, a veteran fighter in this struggle, shared with me, was that this was how they showed the men that we're serious. When we talk about fighting, we're serious. So that kind of potential for resistance, sometimes we see this happening in these communities, in the most marginalized spaces, and oftentimes happening in very surprising ways, where where the kind of conventional expectation, these are traditional communities, they're very patriarchal, they're very they're very horribly oppressed, etc., etc. These women are the ones who are actually leading the fight. And I'm also reminded of this example Rob Nixon recounts in his book Slow Violence, Wangari Maathai and the Green Belt movement in Kenya, where it's women who are mobilizing and fighting not only the local struggles, but actually articulating visions for a different kind of world. They're critiquing not only the deforestation processes, but also the privatization and liberalization processes that the Kenyan elite are beholden to via the World Bank. And they're calling this out in very gendered terms as well. Like, you men are destroying the world, and we have a different vision, right? I mean, this kind of thing. Again, it's something that, to bring this to a close. I mean, I would kind of say one of the things that I learned, and very happy to have learned, was that we can't any longer separate these kinds of struggles, the social and the sectoral. They're the social and the political economic, right? Mm-hmm. They're all like deeply interwoven, and empowerment within the social spaces, within these kinds of contexts, in artisanal fishing communities, and in the home, etc., are intimately tied to a politics of resistance and the potential for a revolutionary future.
Yeah, no, and the book, I'm really grateful for the book, because it does dwell with that complexity. I just sort of agree that we do need to do our best to sort of evolve terms that match the complexity of life as it's lived, because even the terms that we've sort of inherited from sociology and anthropology of like structure versus agency or something aren't completely adequate for our current moment of deep complexity. So I think like ecology, especially like the way that you're trying to engage with the problem of ecology and the economy, sort of like that is where I'm trying to kind of devote a lot of my own like intellectual energy. And I really like this one quote from the book, and I know I'm like keeping you now for quite a long time, where you say like, the economy is this thing in public discourse that hovers over our heads like an extraneous entity that we're repeatedly told has its own health, feelings, and temperament. That occupies center stage, you say, while living, breathing human beings are asked to just stand in line. Well, what happens when people don't, right? Like, what happens when people are steadfast, as you put it, in their rejection of these sorts of, like extractivist kind of models? Isn't that, the seed of something better, building back truly better in a more kind of, like holistic and integrated and connected way that rejects, especially, I think, like these pretty calculated strategies of keeping us atomized, alienated from one another. I just wanted to, again, thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this, Scott. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you for really engaging the book. Good of you to do that. I'm very honored and really grateful for you having done that.
Yeah, well, it was a treat.